From a multitude of top secret, highly secure locations across South Texas, this is the regionally trending Spurs Insider podcast. I'm Mike Finger with Jeff McDonald and Tom Orsborn. And although Nick Talbot will not be joining us this week, we do have the minimum number of participants mandated by the NBA so we can go on, unlike our local cagers. And that, I guess, is where we need to start. We're taping this Tuesday morning. Monday night, the Spurs finally, for the first time this season, had a game postponed due to COVID protocols. Is there anything that either Tom or Jeff would like to say on this subject?
It felt like they dodged a bullet for a long time. Like you would hear all these games being postponed, all these teams having games postponed. Most of the league had. I think there were 21 games postponed before the Spurs got one, and sure enough, it finally caught up with them. And I think, like I said, I was surprised it took so long. I mean, everybody else was getting games postponed left or right because it doesn't take much to get into the contact tracing situation that both the Spurs and Pelicans got into. And I'm surprised it hadn't happened before a month into the season to the local cagers.
I filed a notebook just a couple of hours before, leading off with Lonnie Walker saying the night before, how blessed they were to have dodged this. And lo and behold, just a few hours later, the word came down from the NBA. So, yeah, it was, I was on a Zoom call. Jeff was too, with waiting for Stan Van Gundy, and they abruptly ended that call. And it just happened really quickly.
I believe the Spurs were the 24th team in the league to have a game postponed by this. So, along those lines that y'all were talking about, it's happened to just about everybody, and that number will probably get up to 30 before long. But go ahead, Jeff. What were you going to say?
I guess it's a coincidence. I mean, it's only a coincidence, but it was a funny coincidence that it came like right after they play the Wizards.
Right.
Where all the talk before that game was the Wizards had 6 games in a row postponed, hadn't played in 13 days. Scotty Brooks and all the Wizards players were talking before that game about just how good it was to be back on the floor and how just awful it was to almost not to be able to practice for that whole time, not even be able to get into your practice facility, not even be able to get together as a team for those 13 days. Scott Brooks was talking about, all they got to do was show up at the parking lot of their practice facility twice a day for that period to get tested. And if you saw a player and, driving by in his car, you could wave, but you couldn't even roll down the window and talk to him. So all that was going on Sunday night. That was the talk. You mentioned that to Pop before the game. He's just talking about how badly he feels for the Wizards and how horrible that sounds. And that's just an impossible situation to deal with. And then, 24 hours later, it hits the Spurs. I don't know that it'll be as bad as it was for the Wizards. They had an actual outbreak in their locker room. So I don't imagine that the Spurs will be out of action for 13 days. I mean, we don't really know that at this point, but I wouldn't guess that. But it's just sort of funny that was already on everyone's brain about how terrible it is to have games postponed and have your schedule thrown out of whack. And then it hits the Spurs just immediately after that.
To be clear, we can't confirm as of this podcast exactly who it was that triggered this contact tracing, but we can say some things that we know for sure. One of which, okay, first of all, they played Sunday night against the Wizards. There were no COVID positives as of then. They traveled to New Orleans for the game Monday against the Pelicans. And every player in the traveling party, basically every player on the team, had to do COVID tests that morning, correct?
That is correct.
Then as of Monday afternoon, the Spurs put out their daily injury update. And I think it's safe to say that injury update was posted after one would expect that all of the morning COVID test results were in. And as of that injury update, the only player on the list was Derek White and his broken toe. So if the listeners out there, who I know are highly intelligent listeners, can kind of put the two and two together, I think it would not be outrageous to assume that as of the morning tests, all was fine with the Spurs, and that it's possible that the positive test could have come from outside the locker room, and this was just a contact tracing thing. And like Jeff mentioned earlier, the NBA is becoming more and more cautious about this. It doesn't take much to kind of trigger this protocol in terms of who has had contact with someone who might have tested positive. So if all of that kind of follows logically, there's a chance that nobody on the team itself actually has COVID. Now, the reason you do the contact tracing is because they had contact with someone who had it, and they might have gotten it. But we don't know at this moment that anyone on the team has it.
What it sounds like to me happened, and this is a lot of conjecture, a lot of just putting some puzzle pieces together. There was some positive tests somewhere from some that players from both teams came in contact with. This came to light pretty late in the afternoon on Monday, pretty close to that tip off, and there just wasn't enough time to contact trace everyone in order to clear them for the game. To me, that's what happened. Maybe if this comes to light, at 6 a.m. on Monday, they're able to get through all the contact tracing and get the game in. But it sounds to me, and again, just conjecture, this was sort of a late breaking event that they just didn't have time to unravel before the game was supposed to be played.
Right. And that could be the way this unfolded could bode well for the Spurs avoiding all those hassles that you mentioned earlier with the Wizards. Like this, I still think as of Tuesday morning, as we're taping this in our secure locations, if you set, what was it, the Wizards went 13 days without a game. If you set that as the over under, I'd bet on the under for the Spurs in terms of when they'd come back.
Yeah, for sure. And if they, if from here the schedule goes on as planned, if right now we don't know about Wednesday's game against Boston. As for now, it's still on. Boston was planning on flying to San Antonio today, which we're taping this on Tuesday. If that game goes on, it's almost kind of works out for the Spurs because they were starting a 5-7 stretch of games, and this kind of removes one of those back-to-backs,
right,
and gives them an extra little breathing time. Assuming everything else works out for them. Obviously, it's not great if 4 guys have COVID, which I don't think will happen. But if everybody's cleared, I think they end up kind of catching a break here.
Bigger picture, this is just something. This probably won't be the last time for the Spurs. I mean, even if they dodge this one, this is just something that the league is going to have to deal with probably until the playoffs. And I don't know whether that's way too far down the line to know whether the playoffs go to a bubble or whether the vaccines are having their impact by then, or if things get better as a nation, as a world by then. But I think for at least the next couple of months, until the ball tips off each night, there's going to be questions as to whether the game's going to happen, and that's just something we're going to have to adjust to.
Yeah, and it's I guess maybe it's a good thing fans aren't in the building at most of these places, so you don't have to send them home.
Right.
Although there's a bunch of places that are starting to open up, so it's kind of interesting. On the one hand, you have games getting postponed left and right, and you have other arenas that are beginning to open at some form of capacity. It's kind of an odd juxtaposition, which I think is a word in English.
That's one of the bigger words used on the Spurs Insider podcast, and that's why listeners tune to this podcast and leave reviews, which I've been told helps us out, even when some of the reviews. I don't understand this. I've been told that some of the reviews mention that we might be condescending towards our listeners. And I don't get that at all. I have nothing but praise for our listeners.
Honestly, it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, those people are idiots.
But yes, and I'm not Buck Rogers. I don't understand how the world of podcasting, how it gets to these listeners. But it's been mentioned to me that it helps if people review it and on the various interwebs and outlets where you get the podcast and say nice things, even if they aren't totally sincere. It's just nice to be nice. And we'd appreciate that. And also check us out at expressnews.com. Subscribe to the Spurs Nation newsletter. That's what this is all about. Hopefully the Spurs Nation newsletter and expressnews.com will feature more game coverage. And on that note, we can get to some of that game coverage since our last podcast. I think we taped the last one the day after the Portland game when things were going, that the team was soaring and you knew that there was going to be some bumps eventually. The rest of that week was Golden State and Dallas. Those games were kind of maybe a self-correction, regression to the mean in a way. And then the Wizards game Sunday where they kind of beat up on a team that was in a bad spot. But before this Monday COVID story developed, what were your guys' impression as to the on-court Spurs and where they were headed?
It's still a team that's all over the map. It seems like every time we reconvene here in our secure locations to take the temperature of the team, it just veers all over the place, hot and cold. One week it looks like they're soaring, and the next week it looks like they're back to being the worst team in the Western Conference. So I think what I'm kind of learning about this team, it's roughly a 500 team, maybe a little better than 500. And so, like you said, there's going to be weeks where there's correction to the mean. Like it's hard to get. I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's hard to get too. As soon as you start feeling like, wow, they've won 4 out of 5 games, and they're kicking butt on the road, and they beat the Lakers and the Clippers, and they routed Portland. They kind of tend to bring you back down to earth. And maybe what I'm saying is that's just to be expected this season because this team is what it is, which is a decent team that's going to win some games and lose some games and end up kind of in that 500 area.
Tomas?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of talk after the Dallas game out of the locker room was, the slow starts, slow start against Golden State, slow start initially against Dallas before they got back into the game and then fell behind by 18 in the second quarter. And it's interesting, last year they were having the same conversations early in the season, albeit in November and December rather than January. But, you look at I looked at some of the quotes from last year from DeMar, and it was almost word for word the same. Just that frustration at how this team continuously, maybe not continuously, that's too much, but too strong, but they do tend to get off to slow starts and always, not only in the first quarter, but the third quarter. And then they, round back into shape in the second and fourth. But it's just, it's frustrating for these guys. And I know for Pop as well, that they just can't seem to have the same energy they have early on that they have later in the game.
Tom, do you know who I just realized who was way ahead of the curve, Ringo? Was that reporter in Denver during the
right
during the playoff series 2 years ago? Before that series went 7 games. There's a pregame media availability with Greg Popovich and Michael Malone before every game, and before game 1, game 2, game 3, game 4, game 5, game 6, and game 7. This reporter from Denver asked about the importance of the first quarter every time. Every time. Yeah. And, we made fun of them, but, almost 2 years later, Spurs still struggling in the first quarter, and they should have listened to the guy.
Yeah. If you're talking about the Spurs are having trouble getting out, they're sluggish to start the first and third quarter. I'm not Red Auerbach, but it sounds like there might be a trouble with the starting lineup then.
Yeah. Of course, against Dallas, you lose DeJounte Murray in the first minute.
Yeah.
But still, it's Dallas. I mean, Porzingis and Doncic, they were there at the beginning of the game, and Luka was there at the end of the game to cap that one off. So it was just tough guys to defend.
Yeah, they were also down.
No
by
matter
10
who's on the court.
They were also down by 10 to start that game against the version of the Wizards that showed up here too. I don't know.
Yeah.
I can't put my finger on it, but if you're telling me, I'm just going by what you're telling me. If you're telling me they're having trouble with first and third quarters, it sounds to me like that's a starting lineup problem. I don't know what the fix is.
So is there a solution there?
I think they should. If you would have asked me this at this time last year, I would have said they should start Lonnie Walker.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be the solution because he is starting. So I don't know.
So maybe you start Devin.
Start Devin Vassell and Trey Jones. And they got Eubanks back, right? Maybe he can play some. I'm joking. I don't know what the solution is.
Well, the flip side of that is if the starting lineup is having those difficulties, then what does that say about how good the bench has been? And I mean, you can look at those plus minuses of that Wizards game. And this actually made sense when you considered the Wizards were shorthanded, hadn't played in 13 days. The way the Spurs were going to have a huge edge was in depth and in endurance. And so, of course, they were going to come out with their hair on fire to start out the game. And that's not where the conditioning gets you. It's in the bench. And I think, that was an extreme example because the Wizards hadn't played in 2 weeks, but the Spurs their depth ranks up there league wide. They don't have the superstars. They are, a 500, a borderline playoff team, but that's one of the areas where they can really make hay, as is a saying that I heard in my youth, make hay while the sun shines.
Except they meant it literally where you grew up, right?
That's true. Yeah. We did make hay.
This was not a figurative thing.
It was absolutely not figurative. I hauled hay on the back of a flatbed truck. That was my summer job. But no one cares about that. They care about the hay that the Spurs bench is making and hauling. And Jeff, you mentioned, I think on Twitter that like Patty Mills is actually getting some attention for sixth man of the year this year. He's had a really good year.
Pop is coming close to sort of pumping that. The Pop isn't big on
anything
advertising for awards and stuff. But he's not saying sixth man of the year award, but he's saying Patty's doing what he does for us off the bench is important, and he's doing it better than anybody in the league, which I think is a quote from the other day. Yeah. So yeah, even he is sort of fueling some of that recognition for Patty Mills. And I haven't looked at what every other bench player in the NBA is doing, and it's way too early to look at those awards. But Patty's having a great year off the bench for him. That's all you can say. He for the most part, he is being FIBA Patty. He does have those. He's had a game or two where he's won for freaking 13, and that doesn't help. But God bless him, he keeps firing away, and I guess that's what you want in that role.
Yeah. And in terms of tinkering, I know you were being sort of facetious about the lineup thing because honestly, I'm not sure what the obvious lineup move would be. And first of all, I don't think it's a huge problem, the starting lineup. I think they're playing the guys they should be playing. When we were talking about lineups a year ago, we were talking about we still had Aldridge and Pirtle playing together. It was way more lumbering. At least now with this lineup, they're playing Brent Forbes. They were obvious guys that were candidates to move to the bench a year ago. Now you're not, no matter how many people complain, how much he struggles, like LaMarcus Aldridge is not going to move to the bench. And I'm not even saying he should. I think because like Jeff and Tom, you both pointed out in the past, when does LaMarcus have his best games? What is the common denominator when LaMarcus plays great? It's when he starts great, right? Yeah. So if it would be kind of counterproductive in that way to start him on the bench when LaMarcus at his best is scoring, 8 points in the first 4 minutes. So maybe there's something to, if he hasn't started well, get him on the bench in the first few minutes, let him reset and go from there. But I don't think, when Tom mentioned looking up stories from a year ago and some of the frustration that was there from DeMar and what have you, like this team is in a much different place now than it was a year ago. I think the optimism is higher. I think they have a much better feel for what they want to do. Even though they're having some of the same problems in terms of slow starts, I just think it's kind of apples and oranges between the beginning of last year and this year.
I mean, going back to LaMarcus, they just need him to play better, more consistently.
Yeah,
he's had some good games this year, and he's also had some clunkers. They need him to be more even keel, I think. I mean, I don't think it's much of a. This is not a coincidence that the last time the Spurs really did get off to a good start and open a game like gangbusters was in Portland, when LaMarcus took 6 of their first 7 shots and made 4 of them and was just on fire. Like when they can get him going, it just seems like everything else is just so much easier for them. And he had this stretch where it was 4 points or 20, 4 points or 20, like game to game. He alternated 4 points then 20, 4 points then 20, and they just need a higher level of consistency from him. I mean, he's not going to be the all-star he was 3, 4, 6, 7 years ago. He's not going to be that guy. But if they could just have a guy that they know what they're going to get from him on a nightly basis, I think that might iron out some of these slow starts.
Yeah, maybe DeMar in a way is talking about himself. I mean, he's such a player that has to gain a feel for everything, and he's talked about that. He has to gain a feel for how the defense is playing him and so forth before he gets it going.
Yeah, I'm sure that he definitely is talking about himself in that way. I mean, he's as self-critical as anybody in the league. But one thing I'll say about DeMar, and we've noticed this about him since he came to San Antonio in the Kawhi trade. Like, he is not one, unlike LaMarcus, I think, he is not one to let some early struggles slow him down. Like, he's going to keep at it. And how many games have we seen of his where he looks completely lost in the first quarter and the first half, and then just kind of pours it on at the end? I do think that even some of his critics out there have to admire the way he perseveres through some tough situations. And that's there have been some games in the past 3 years that he hasn't finished great, in the last minute or two, but there's been a lot of them where he's overcome some early misses and gotten on a second half roll. And I think that just having him around is a big benefit when the Spurs do get off to slow starts, because they do tend to come back from a lot of them, and even if they don't come all the way back from a lot of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I maybe the slow start isn't necessarily the first couple of minutes. It's just falling into those big holes, those double-digit holes that they tend to get into.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of energy to get out of it.
I haven't looked into how much of an anomaly this is in the league. It seems like every game that the Spurs are behind double digits or ahead double digits and things even out. I have a feeling that's sort of common throughout the league, away from the Lakers and the Clippers and teams like that. It's a cliche, but it's a game of runs. And going back to something we talked about earlier, I think just the fact that the Spurs have so much faith in their bench helps in terms of avoiding those prolonged downswings where there's always somebody they can bring off the bench to kind of help things out. We don't know when the next game will be. As of right now, we're assuming it will be Wednesday against the Celtics, and I guess we can operate for the rest of this podcast under the assumption that the Spurs will be playing the Celtics on Wednesday at home, the Nuggets and the Grizzlies on Friday and Saturday in a back-to-back. These are all possible playoff teams, probable playoff teams, more tests for the Spurs before the schedule eventually eases up a little bit. What are the keys, assuming they're playing, to weathering this next stretch, Jeff McDonald?
I was going to say the keys are negative COVID tests, for one.
Yeah.
But it seemed like last week we talked about how the schedule gets lighter. When does that start? Because they played the Wizards, and then it's just a bunch of
after the All-Star break.
Yeah. I think that's what I'm starting to notice. When the Spurs were a 60-win team every year, you could look at these stretches that look like, well, that's a pretty soft stretch. When you're a 500 team, every stretch is tough. Like everybody can beat you, So, Boston is getting some bodies back, so they're going to have closer to a full complement of players, and they're a team that people for years have been one of the better teams of the Eastern Conference. Denver's playing great. The Spurs did go down to Memphis and beat the Grizzlies on the opening night, but they did give up 44 points to Ja Morant. So obviously that's a dangerous team. There's no gimmies on that schedule coming up, even if you do have the negative COVID tests.
The road trip, the rodeo trip, they start off with Atlanta, Charlotte, Detroit, Cleveland. But even those teams,
Then
Atlanta,
the Knicks.
Yeah, and
that's
the
kind of what I'm
Knicks.
talking about. In the old days with the Spurs, you'd look at that as like that's the start of a rodeo trip they're going to just roll through. But I don't feel comfortable. I mean, those are all teams the Spurs could beat. Certainly, like it's better than playing the best teams in the league to start that trip.
Right,
But they could lose all those games to any of those teams. Like none of those are gimmies.
Right. Yeah.
I have a feeling that, what you said is true. All those games are losable. But I have a feeling that this is the year when they go back to the annual routine from several years back of peaking or starting the upward trend on the rodeo trip.
As people are always saying about you, you're the most optimistic son of a gun that I know.
So many people say that.
So many people are saying that,
including in the reviews for our podcast, where I think I don't know this for sure. Earnest, delightful. I think people say, just a joy to be around. That's how I try to live my life.
You are the light of a lot of people's lives. Like when
What
they have
you
dark
see
clouds,
is what you get with Mike Finger.
And what you see is just joy of living. But what I was saying was
the world.
That's true. For many years during the Greg Popovich, Tim Duncan, Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili era, and our listeners know this, when the Spurs would start their road trip, and a lot of times the road trip, the rodeo road trip looked more daunting than it does this year. That's when they'd come together. That's when they'd hit their stride. That's when they'd become the team, as Pop said many times. That's when they kind of found themselves and became the team they eventually would become down the stretch. That hasn't been the case the past few years for a number of reasons. They weren't as good as they used to be. The rodeo trips in recent years have included some pretty brutal West Coast swings. But this year, I think the combination of the road disadvantage isn't what it used to be during COVID. They're playing some teams in the East. I think the team is younger and probably more likely to be able to weather the demands of a trip like this. I just think I think there's a possibility that this could be a good rodeo trip for them, and that's still a month or so away. But another thing I want to mention while I'm being rosy and upbeat, looking at the Buck Rogers staff at 538.com, where they crunch the numbers and play games on paper and all that kind of stuff. Spurs 58% chance, according to their projections, of making the playoffs, which means a top 8 seed this year. more likely than not, according to the nerds, of making the playoffs. So it's not just me that is looking at this bright side of things. What do you guys feel about that? Is 58% to be a top 8 seed? Does that sound right?
I think 538 just has some bias in their state polling, so that they can't. I don't know how accurate they are. We might be surprised on election day.
Yeah.
Is that an area code?
538 is not an area code.
Oh, okay. I thought it was in Massachusetts or Vermont or something.
But that's a pretty good reference there, Ringo. Yeah, so we're hitting the end of this. Like always, because of the host of this podcast is known for joy, we like to end on a positive note. And so we're going to choose to believe that the Spurs, the local Cagers, will be back on the court. If not Wednesday, then soon. And that music played by our producer is just a great part of the show. Our weekly affirmation that just look on the bright side.
Over here.
Look on the bright side. Think about the good stuff. Take care of each other. And as always, keep it real.